February 1945, Iwo Jima. The volcanic sand beneath their boots was black as charcoal, hot as a furnace, and stained with blood that dried too quickly in the Pacific sun. The air tasted of sulfur and salt water, thick with smoke from naval bombardment that had been thundering for days. In a shell crater halfway up the slopes of Mount Suribachi, a young Japanese officer named Lieutenant Hideaki Watanabe pressed his back against the jagged rock, his uniform torn, his left leg shattered below the knee. Around him lay the remnants of his platoon, 17 men reduced to 4 in less than an hour of fighting. The sounds of battle rolled across the island like an approaching storm, the crack of rifle fire, the deep percussion of mortars, the mechanical grinding of American tanks clawing their way inland through the volcanic ash. Watanabe had been told many things about the Americans. He had been told they were soft, decadent, corrupted by their wealth and their obsession with individual comfort. He had been told they would break easily under the righteous fury of the Imperial Japanese Army, that their democracy made them weak, that their soldiers fought without honor or true conviction. These lessons had been hammered into him at the military academy in Tokyo, repeated in training camps, reinforced in every briefing before every battle. The Americans, he had learned, were a nation of merchants and materialists who could never understand the spiritual strength of Bushido, the way of the warrior. But here, in this crater, bleeding into the black sand, Lieutenant Watanabe was about to discover that everything he had been taught was about to be tested. Against a reality far stranger than any ideology could predict, the first American Marine appeared, at the crater's rim, like an apparition through the smoke. Watanabe's remaining soldiers tensed, fingers tightening on triggers, preparing for the final confrontation they had been trained to embrace. Death before dishonor, death before surrender. These were not mere words, but sacred duties, obligations that transcended the individual and touched the eternal. But the Marine did not fire. Instead, he shouted something in English, his voice cutting through the din of battle, and raised one hand palm forward in a gesture Watanabe did not immediately understand. Then another figure appeared. This one wore the same uniform but carried no rifle. On his helmet, painted in white against the olive drab, was a red cross enclosed in a white circle. The man, a medic, slid down into the crater with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before, and he moved not toward the American wounded, but toward Watanabe. The Japanese lieutenant's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol at his belt, but the pain in his leg was too great, his fingers too slow. The American medic knelt beside him, and in that moment, time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. Watanabe could see the man's face clearly now, young, perhaps 23 or 24, with blue eyes and a smudge of ash across his cheek. The medic's hands moved quickly, efficiently, cutting away the torn fabric of Watanabe's trousers to expose the wound. And then the medic did something that shattered every conception Watanabe had held about his enemy. He began to treat the wound, not roughly, not as an afterthought, but with the same careful attention, the same focused intensity that Watanabe imagined the man would give to one of his own comrades. The medic pulled a morphine syringe from his kit, injected it into Watanabe's thigh, then began cleaning the wound with antiseptic that stung like fire but promised survival instead of infection. Around them, the battle continued to rage, but in that crater, a different kind of confrontation was taking place, one that weapons could not decide. This was not supposed to happen. To understand the depth of Watanabe's confusion, we must step back from that volcanic island and examine the ideological chasm that separated the Japanese and American militaries. In the winter of 1945, the Pacific War was not merely a contest of arms and territory. It was a collision between fundamentally incompatible visions of what it meant to be a soldier, what it meant to be human, and what obligations the living owed to each other on the battlefield. The Japanese military system had been forged in the fires of centuries-old samurai traditions, reshaped by the militarism of the 1930s and hardened by a philosophy that subordinated the individual completely to the collective will of the empire. The Senjin-kun, or Military Field Code, issued in 1941, explicitly forbade surrender. "Do not live in shame as a prisoner," it commanded. "Die to ensure you do not leave behind a name soiled by disgrace." This was not hyperbole or propaganda meant only for public consumption. It was doctrine enforced through training, through social pressure, through the knowledge that capture meant not only personal dishonor, but disgrace for one's entire family lineage. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans took no prisoners, that capture meant torture and execution, that the enemy was barbarous and cruel in ways that justified any measure of resistance. These lessons were reinforced by careful selection of evidence. Stories of American atrocities, real or exaggerated, spread through the ranks. When Japanese soldiers did encounter captured comrades who had been killed, those deaths were held up as proof of American savagery, regardless of the circumstances that had led to them. The psychological architecture was complete. Surrender was both morally unthinkable and practically suicidal. But on the American side, a different philosophy governed. The United States had ratified the Geneva Convention of 1929, which established clear rules for the treatment of prisoners of war and wounded combatants. More than international law, however, American military medicine had evolved a doctrine that prioritized the treatment of the most severely wounded first, regardless of nationality. This principle, called triage, was based on medical necessity, not political ideology. The most critical patients received attention first because they had the greatest need and the greatest potential to benefit from immediate intervention. A Japanese soldier bleeding out from a femoral artery wound would be treated before an American with a broken arm, not out of mercy or humanitarianism in the abstract, but because medical science dictated that approach. This created situations that would have been incomprehensible to Japanese military planners. American medics, moving through battlefields still hot with combat, would stabilize enemy wounded before moving to their own injured comrades if those enemy soldiers were in more critical condition. It was a practice rooted in medical training, in the Hippocratic tradition, in a belief that the profession of healing transcended the temporary hatreds of war. But to Japanese soldiers, raised in a system that emphasized hierarchy, collective identity, and absolute distinction between friend and enemy, this behavior appeared almost supernatural in its strangeness. The documentary evidence reveals that these encounters were not isolated incidents but repeated patterns that gradually penetrated Japanese military consciousness throughout the Pacific Campaign. In the captured diaries of Japanese soldiers recovered from Guadalcanal, Saipan, Peleliu, and Okinawa, recurring themes emerge: surprise, confusion, a gradual erosion of certainty about what the Americans truly were. One diary entry, recovered from a Japanese officer killed on Saipan in June 1944, recorded an encounter that closely paralleled Watanabe's experience. "Wounded in the leg, I awaited death. But American doctor came, treated wound, gave water. I do not understand. We were told they kill prisoners. This doctor risked his life to save mine. What manner of soldiers are these?" Another, from a soldier who survived the Battle of Peleliu and was captured in September 1944, described watching American medics work. "They do not distinguish. Japanese, American, all the same to them. The medical men wear Red Cross. They carry no weapons. Even in battle, we do not fire on them. Not from mercy, from confusion. They violate everything we understand about war." These testimonies accumulated slowly, passed in whispers between survivors, dismissed by officers as enemy propaganda or the delusions of men broken by combat stress. But the evidence kept mounting, and it carried with it a subversive question. If the Americans could display this kind of discipline, This kind of adherence to principle, even in the chaos of battle. What did that suggest about the strength of their system, rather than its weakness? Return to the crater. The morphine has begun to work, dulling the sharp edges of Watanabe's agony. The American medic has applied a pressure bandage and a splint, working with quick competence, while his rifle-carrying companion stands guard at the crater's rim, scanning for threats. The medic speaks in English, his tone calm and professional, though Watanabe understands none of the words. But he understands the actions. He understands that this man is trying to save his life. The medic produces something from his pack, a small chocolate bar, U.S. Army issue, wrapped in olive drab paper. He unwraps it, breaks off a piece, and offers it to Watanabe. The gesture is simple, almost casual, but it carries enormous weight. In the Japanese military, rations had been reduced again and again, as supply lines collapsed and the empire's productive capacity crumbled under American bombing and submarine warfare. Watanabe could not remember the last time he had tasted chocolate. Most days, he and his men had subsisted on rice that was more weevils than grain, supplemented occasionally with seaweed or whatever they could scavenge from the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima. The chocolate bar became, in that moment, more than sustenance. It became a symbol of the vast material gulf that separated the two armies. American soldiers carried chocolate as a routine part of their field rations. They carried cigarettes, chewing gum, canned fruit, powdered coffee. Their medical supplies were abundant enough that a medic could spend precious morphine and bandages on an enemy soldier without depleting his stocks below safe levels. This was not merely wealth. It was systematic, industrialized abundance deployed across an ocean, sustained across thousands of miles of supply chain, maintained even in the midst of terrible combat. Watanabe took the chocolate. The sweetness on his tongue was almost shocking after months of deprivation. And with that taste came a recognition that he fought to suppress. The Americans could afford to be merciful because they could afford everything else. Their mercy was not weakness, but the luxury of strength. They could treat enemy wounded because they had surplus morphine, surplus bandages, surplus time, because their overwhelming firepower had created space for medical care even in the middle of battle. This was the lesson that Japanese officers had most feared their soldiers learning, the truth that propaganda worked ceaselessly to obscure. American abundance was not a sign of decadence, but a demonstration of incomparable power. A nation that could field millions of soldiers while simultaneously feeding them chocolate and treating enemy wounded was not soft. It was terrifyingly, unstoppably strong. The historical record shows that American military medicine in World War II represented a revolution in battlefield care that no other nation could match in scale or effectiveness. The U.S. Army Medical Department deployed more than 600,000 personnel during the war: doctors, nurses, medics, corpsmen, technicians. They established a system of graduated care that began with battalion aid stations just behind the front lines and extended through field hospitals, evacuation hospitals, and general hospitals in rear areas, ultimately connecting back to hospitals in the United States through medical transport ships and aircraft. The statistics tell a story of unprecedented medical achievement. Of American soldiers wounded in World War II, more than 96% who reached medical care alive survived their wounds. This was a survival rate unimaginable in previous conflicts, achieved through advances in trauma surgery, the mass production of penicillin, improved blood transfusion techniques, and the rapid evacuation of wounded from the battlefield. The entire system was designed around a simple principle: every wounded soldier, regardless of how far forward he had been injured, would receive definitive surgical care within 12 hours, but the system extended beyond American casualties. Military doctors and medics took seriously their obligations under the Geneva Convention to treat enemy wounded. Field manuals explicitly instructed medical personnel that enemy prisoners of war and wounded were entitled to the same standard of care as American soldiers. This was not merely theoretical. After-action reports from across the Pacific theater document cases where Japanese wounded received blood transfusions, surgical procedures, and post-operative care identical to what American casualties received. The Japanese military medical system, by contrast, had collapsed under the pressure of extended war and severed supply lines. By 1945, Japanese military hospitals were critically short of anesthetics, antibiotics, surgical instruments, and even basic supplies like bandages and antiseptics. Morphine had become so scarce that it was reserved for only the most extreme cases. Many wounded Japanese soldiers received no pain relief at all, enduring amputations and other procedures while fully conscious. Medical personnel were themselves malnourished and disease-ridden, working in conditions that would have been unthinkable in any American facility. This medical inequality manifested most starkly when wounded Japanese soldiers were captured and treated by American forces. Prisoners evacuated to American hospital ships or field hospitals found themselves in environments that seemed fantastical compared to what they had known. Clean sheets, abundant food, pain medication, surgical care performed under anesthesia by well-rested surgeons with proper instruments. Some Japanese prisoners, wounded and captured on islands like Saipan and Okinawa, gained more weight during their first month in American medical care than they had weighed at any point in the previous year of active service. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. Japanese soldiers had been taught that Americans were spiritually weak, that their materialism made them inferior warriors, that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome American industrial might. But spirit could not suture an artery. Willpower could not cure gangrene. And when wounded Japanese soldiers received care that their own military could no longer provide, the ideological certainty that had sustained them began to crack. Lieutenant Watanabe remained conscious through his evacuation from the crater. American Marines carried him on a stretcher back through their lines, passing foxholes and artillery positions, moving him steadily toward the beach where hospital ships waited offshore. The journey took hours, and throughout it Watanabe had ample opportunity to observe the American military machine in operation. What he saw challenged everything he had been taught. The American positions were not chaotic or disordered. Supplies moved forward in systematic rotation, ammunition, water, rations, medical supplies, all flowing in an unbroken stream from the ships offshore to the front lines. Radio operators communicated constantly, coordinating artillery fire and air support with a precision that suggested endless practice. Tanks and armored vehicles moved where they were needed, supported by infantry that worked in practiced coordination. This was not the army of soft merchants that Japanese propaganda had described. This was a military machine of extraordinary sophistication and discipline. But more disturbing to Watanabe than the material abundance or tactical proficiency was the attitude of the Americans themselves. The Marines who carried his stretcher did not abuse him or mock him. They did not display hatred or revenge. They were professional, almost detached, doing their job with the same workmanlike efficiency that characterized everything else he had seen. One Marine, noticing that Watanabe was conscious and thirsty, stopped long enough to give him water from a canteen, clean, fresh water, freely given to an enemy who hours before had been trying to kill him. This casual humanity was perhaps the most subversive element of all. Watanabe had been prepared for cruelty. He had been prepared for death. He had not been prepared for this methodical, impersonal kindness that treated him not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a problem to be solved, a wounded human being to be processed through a medical system that made no distinction between American and Japanese blood. When Watanabe reached the battalion aid station, he entered a world that bore no resemblance to anything he had experienced in the Japanese military. The aid station was an organized miracle of triage and treatment. Wounded men lay on cots in rows, divided by the severity of their injuries. Medics moved between them with practiced efficiency, administering plasma, adjusting bandages, monitoring vital signs. A surgical team worked under bright electric lights, powered by a portable generator, operating on the most critical cases. And scattered among the American wounded were Japanese soldiers, receiving the same care, attended by the same medical personnel, distinguished only by their uniforms and the different language they spoke in their delirium. A Navy corpsman examined Watanabe's leg, consulted briefly with a doctor, and marked him for evacuation to a hospital ship. Within an hour, Watanabe found himself being loaded onto a landing craft for the short journey offshore. The hospital ship USS Solace loomed above him, painted white, with enormous red crosses on its hull and superstructure. Illuminated even at night in defiance of submarine threat, because international law protected hospital ships from attack. Japanese forces had respected that designation throughout the war, just as American forces avoided firing on Japanese hospital ships when they could be identified. Aboard the Solace, Watanabe entered an environment so divorced from his recent experience that it might as well have been another planet. The ship was clean, bright, temperature-controlled. Medical personnel moved through the wards in crisp white uniforms. Surgical suites gleamed with stainless steel and proper lighting. The smell was antiseptic rather than gangrenous. And everywhere, was the evidence of abundance. Abundant medicine, abundant equipment, abundant food, abundant care. A surgeon examined Watanabe's leg and determined that the bone, though fractured, could be saved with proper setting and treatment. Under anesthesia, blessed. Unconsciousness without pain, the surgery was performed. When Watanabe woke, his leg was encased in a proper cast, the wound cleaned and sutured, antibiotics already coursing through his system to prevent infection. A nurse checked his vital signs, adjusted his IV, and moved on to the next patient. The entire process was routine, unremarkable. The sort of medical care that the American system delivered thousands of times every day across the Pacific theater. But for Watanabe, there was nothing routine about it. He had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to his former certainties. The historical record reveals that Watanabe was far from unique. As the Pacific War ground toward its conclusion, more and more Japanese soldiers and officers found themselves receiving medical care from their enemies, and that care became a form of psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda leaflet. The experience of being treated humanely by Americans when Japanese military doctrine insisted that capture meant torture and death created a cognitive dissonance that many Japanese prisoners could not resolve. Interviews with Japanese prisoners of war, conducted by American intelligence officers in 1945, reveal a pattern of ideological collapse that often began with medical care. One captured officer told his interrogators, "I was prepared to die. Death is simple, but to live as a prisoner treated with respect, given food and medical care, this I was not prepared for. My officers lied to me about what capture would mean. If they lied about this, what else was a lie?" Another prisoner, wounded at Okinawa and treated at an American field hospital, described his confusion in starker terms. "I watched American doctor save Japanese soldier's life. Operated for 3 hours. Used blood from American soldier for transfusion. I asked translator why. Doctor said because the wound was severe and the soldier would die without surgery. This is not how enemies behave. This is not war as I understood it." The symbolic power of these medical encounters extended beyond the individuals directly involved. In prisoner of war camps, where captured Japanese soldiers were held for the remainder of the war, stories of medical care circulated and multiplied. The camps themselves, operated under strict adherence to Geneva Convention standards, provided further evidence that American behavior did not match Japanese propaganda. Prisoners received adequate food, medical care, shelter, and even recreational activities. They were not tortured or executed. Many gained weight and recovered from diseases and malnutrition that had plagued them during active service. Some prisoners, confronted with the gap between what they had been told and what they experienced, underwent dramatic psychological transformations. A program of re-education, operated by American intelligence services, sought to deprogram prisoners from militarist ideology and prepare them for return to a post-war Japan. The program's success rates were remarkably high, in part because the prisoners' lived experience had already begun the process of ideological dissolution. Men who had been willing to die. For the Empire found themselves questioning why the Empire had lied to them about so much, but the impact of American medical treatment extended beyond the psychological realm into the practical calculations of Japanese military leadership. As reports filtered back to Tokyo about American medical capabilities and the treatment of Japanese wounded, some officers began to recognize that their own soldiers might be more willing to surrender if they believed survival and humane treatment were possible. This recognition came too late to fundamentally alter Japanese military doctrine, but it contributed to the gradual increase in Japanese surrenders in the final months of the war. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April to June 1945, saw more Japanese soldiers surrender than in any previous Pacific campaign. Over 7,400 prisoners captured compared to the few hundred taken in earlier battles. While many factors contributed to this increase, including the deteriorating military situation and the erosion of unit cohesion, the knowledge that American forces treated prisoners humanely played a role. Japanese soldiers who had encountered American medics or heard stories from captured comrades were more likely to consider surrender as an option. Despite years of indoctrination to the contrary, the chocolate bar that the American medic had given to Watanabe in that volcanic crater became, in the lieutenant's memory, a talisman of transformation. It was such a small thing, a few ounces of sugar and cocoa, wrapped in olive paper, routine issue to every American soldier. But it represented a vast gulf in capacity and philosophy. In the weeks following his evacuation from Iwo Jima, as Watanabe recovered aboard the hospital ship and then in a Navy hospital in Guam, he had time to reflect on what the chocolate symbolized. The Americans could afford to give chocolate to their enemies because they had already won the war of production. Japan's factories were burning under B-29 raids. Its cities were rubble. Its supply lines were severed by American submarines and aircraft. The Empire's soldiers starved while American soldiers discarded surplus rations. The contrast was not merely material but philosophical. One system had proven capable of mobilizing and sustaining overwhelming force while simultaneously maintaining humanitarian principles. The other had demanded total sacrifice while providing nothing in return but slogans and certain death. The chocolate was mercy, but it was also a demonstration of power. It said, "We are so strong that we can afford to be kind. We are so certain of victory that we can treat our enemies as humans rather than as threats. We have so much that giving you this small comfort costs us nothing." And in that calculus, Watanabe recognized the fundamental asymmetry that had doomed Japan from the moment it attacked Pearl Harbor. This recognition spread slowly through the ranks of Japanese prisoners. As the war ground toward its conclusion, in the POW camps, American authorities allowed Japanese prisoners to receive packages from aid organizations, including food and personal items. The packages were modest by American standards, canned goods, dried fruit, candy, cigarettes, but they represented abundance to men who had known only scarcity for years. Each package became evidence that the Americans could afford to feed not only their own vast armies, but their enemies as well. The symbolic power of American abundance extended beyond food to every aspect of military operations. Japanese prisoners observed American soldiers discarding equipment that would have been treasured in the Japanese military. Worn uniforms, slightly damaged tools, boots that could have been repaired. They saw American forces supplied with such profusion that waste was not merely possible, but inevitable. They watched as American engineering units built roads, airfields, and bases with speed and efficiency that seemed impossible given the scale of the Pacific Theater. One Japanese officer, captured on Okinawa and held in a camp in the Philippines, described watching American construction battalions build a new airfield. In 1 week, they did what would have taken our forces a month. Bulldozers, graders, rollers, machines everywhere working day and night. Our soldiers dug with shovels and died from exhaustion. The Americans build with machines and finish ahead of schedule. This is not a war between nations. It is a war between centuries. That observation cut to the heart of the matter. Japan had entered World War II as an industrial power, but one whose industrialization was incomplete and fragile. The United States was something unprecedented in human history. A continental nation with vast resources, protected by oceans, with an industrial capacity that exceeded the rest of the world combined. When those two systems collided, the outcome was never truly in doubt. The only question was how long it would take and how much blood would be spilled before the inevitable conclusion. Lieutenant Watanabe was eventually transferred to a prisoner of war camp on Guam, where he spent the final months of the war. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by American soldiers, but conditions inside bore little resemblance to what he had been taught to expect from captivity. Prisoners received 3 meals a day: rice, vegetables, occasional meat, far more food than Watanabe had seen during his final months of active service. Medical care was available for illness and injury. Prisoners were allowed to exercise, to form recreational groups, even to publish a small camp newspaper. The camp library included books on American history and government, provided by the military's re-education program. Watanabe, whose English was limited, worked through a translated pamphlet that explained the American system of democratic governance. The concepts were alien to him. The idea that government derived its power from the consent of the governed, that leaders could be removed through elections, that individual rights existed independent of collective obligations. But as he read, he found himself comparing these principles to what he had experienced. The American medic who had treated him on Iwo Jima had not needed orders to provide care. He had acted on his own initiative, following principles that were internalized rather than imposed. The system that produced such behavior was not one of rigid hierarchy and absolute obedience, but something more flexible and, paradoxically, more effective. Individual Americans made decisions based on training and principle, without requiring constant supervision or detailed orders. This allowed the American military to function with a speed and adaptability that the Japanese system, with its emphasis on hierarchy and collective decision-making, could not match. Watanabe began to understand that what Japanese propaganda had characterized as weakness was actually a different kind of strength. Americans did not value individual comfort and rights because they were soft, but because those values produced citizens who could think independently, solve problems creatively, and maintain morale even in difficult circumstances. The American soldier who gave up his blood for a Japanese transfusion, the medic who spent his morphine on an enemy, the system that fed prisoners of war while its own forces fought and died, these were not signs of a weak nation, but of a strong one, confident enough in its principles to maintain them even in the midst of total war. This realization was bitter and liberating in equal measure. Bitter, because it meant that Watanabe had fought for a cause that was not merely lost, but unworthy. Liberating because it offered the possibility of something beyond the militarism that had consumed his nation. When news of Japan's surrender reached the camp in August 1945, Watanabe felt not shame, but relief. The war was over. The dying could stop. And perhaps in defeat, Japan might learn something from the victors, who had proven strong enough to be merciful. The documentary evidence from the final days of the Pacific War reveals hundreds of stories similar to Watanabe's, stories of Japanese soldiers and officers, confronting the reality of American military power and discovering that it was inseparable from American values. These encounters did not happen in abstraction but in concrete moments. A medic treating a wound, a soldier sharing a canteen, a system that maintained its principles even when expedience might have suggested abandoning them. The official U.S. Army history of medical operations in the Pacific Theater, published after the war, notes that American medical personnel treated more than 10,000 Japanese wounded during the course of the conflict. Each of those treatments was a small battlefield in the larger war of ideology. Each Japanese soldier who survived because of American medicine became a living testament to the failure of Japanese propaganda. Each prisoner who gained weight in American camps, who received medical care, who was treated in accordance with international law, represented evidence that the Japanese military hierarchy had lied about what surrender would mean. The psychological impact of this evidence extended beyond the war itself into the post-war occupation. When American forces landed in Japan in August 1945, they encountered a population that had been prepared for brutal occupation, for the same kind of atrocities that Japanese forces had committed in occupied territories across Asia. Instead, the occupation forces brought food, medical care and reconstruction assistance. General Douglas MacArthur's administration implemented democratic reforms, rebuilt infrastructure, and established a new constitution that enshrined individual rights and democratic governance. The speed with which Japan transformed from militarist empire to democratic ally was remarkable by any historical standard. Many factors contributed to that transformation: exhaustion from war, the atomic bombings, the Emperor's surrender broadcast, the removal of militarist leadership. But the foundation had been laid by thousands of individual encounters during the war itself. Encounters in which Japanese soldiers discovered that Americans were not the monsters they had been, taught to expect, but humans who maintained their principles even toward their enemies. Lieutenant Watanabe returned to Japan in the spring of 1946, repatriated along with thousands of other prisoners of war. His leg had healed, leaving him with a slight limp but full function, a result of the surgery performed aboard the USS Solace. His family in Tokyo had survived the war, though their home had been destroyed in the firebombing of March 1945. In the devastated landscape of post-war Japan, Watanabe found work as a translator for the occupation forces, using the English he had learned in the POW camp. In that role, he helped bridge the gap between conquerors and conquered, and he brought to the work a unique perspective. He had experienced both Japanese militarism and American democracy at their most extreme, had fought in one system and been healed by the other. When Japanese civilians asked him about the Americans, expecting tales of cruelty and occupation brutality, he told them instead about the medic in the volcanic crater, about the chocolate bar, about the hospital ship where an enemy surgeon had saved his leg and probably his life. The symbolic power of American medical care extended far beyond the individual experiences of soldiers like Watanabe. In the post-war period, as Japan rebuilt under American guidance, the memory of how American forces had treated Japanese wounded became part of the complex mythology of the occupation. It helped establish a narrative in which American power was not merely military, but also moral, a power that could destroy, but also heal, that could defeat without dehumanizing. This narrative served important purposes for both nations. For America, it reinforced the idea that the war had been fought for principles, not merely for national interest, that American forces had maintained their values even in the brutal context of the Pacific War. For Japan, it provided a pathway toward reconciliation and reconstruction, a way to accept defeat without total humiliation. The Americans had been strong enough to win, but also strong enough to be generous in victory. This made the occupation more palatable and the subsequent alliance possible. The medical treatment of enemy wounded became a point of pride in American military culture, cited in training materials and historical accounts as evidence that American forces fought according to rules and principles that distinguished them from their adversaries. The contrast with Japanese military behavior, particularly the atrocities committed in China, the Philippines, and elsewhere, made American adherence to the Geneva Conventions seem not merely legally required, but morally superior. This self-image, while somewhat idealized and glossing over instances where American forces also committed atrocities, nevertheless reflected a genuine difference in military culture and command emphasis. The Japanese self-defense forces, established in the 1950s as Japan remilitarized under American guidance, adopted medical doctrines directly influenced by American practice. The emphasis on preserving life, treating wounded regardless of nationality, and maintaining high standards of military medicine became part of the new Japanese military culture. The transformation was dramatic, from a military that had viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace to one that trained its members in accordance with international humanitarian law. But perhaps the most profound impact of these wartime medical encounters was not institutional but personal. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and officers, like Watanabe, carried with them memories of moments when enemies had behaved with unexpected humanity. These memories could not undo the horrors of war or erase the suffering that had been inflicted and endured, but they provided a foundation for the possibility of reconciliation, a reminder that even in the midst of total war, humans could recognize each other's humanity. The chocolate bar, the morphine syringe, the blood transfusion, the surgical procedure, these became symbols around which a different story could be constructed. Not the story of heroic resistance and noble sacrifice that Japanese militarism had demanded, but a story of survival, adaptation, and eventual understanding. Japanese veterans of the Pacific War who had been captured and treated by American forces often became, in the post-war period, advocates for the democratic reforms that MacArthur's administration implemented. They had seen firsthand that the American system produced not weakness, but strength, not chaos, but order, not cruelty, but the capacity for mercy even toward enemies. This was not a universal transformation. Many Japanese veterans remained bitter about defeat, nostalgic for the militarist period, or simply traumatized by their experiences. But a significant cohort of former soldiers and officers, including many who had been prisoners of war, became supporters of the new democratic Japan precisely because they had experienced the consequences of both systems. They had fought for the empire and received only starvation and certain death. They had been captured by the Americans and received medical care, adequate food, and eventual repatriation. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In the decades following the war, as Japan transformed into an economic powerhouse and close American ally, the story of how American forces had treated Japanese wounded became part of the larger narrative of reconciliation between former enemies. Veterans organizations on both sides commemorated not only the battles, but also the moments of humanity that had punctuated the violence. The medics and corpsmen who had risked their lives to treat enemy wounded were honored alongside the combat troops who had stormed the beaches. Their actions, once routine and unremarkable, were recontextualized as heroic demonstrations of the values that had made victory possible. The crater on Iwo Jima, where Lieutenant Watanabe had been treated, no longer exists. The volcanic island has been reshaped by wind and time, and the specific geography of that day in February 1945 has been erased. But the moment itself persists in memory and in the historical record. One instance among thousands of a pattern that defined the Pacific War as much as the battles themselves. What happened when Japanese officers saw American medics treating enemy wounded first was not a single event, but a repeated confrontation between ideology and reality. Japanese military culture insisted that enemies were to be killed without mercy, that surrender was unthinkable, that the individual existed only as part of the collective. American military culture, while certainly capable of brutality and racism, nevertheless maintained a competing principle, that certain rules transcended the immediate requirements of combat, that medical personnel had obligations under international law, that even enemies retained a basic human dignity that should be respected when possible. These competing principles met on volcanic islands, in jungle clearings, aboard hospital ships, in prisoner of war camps. And when they met, the American principle often prevailed, not because it was morally superior in the abstract, but because it was backed by overwhelming material power and institutional capacity. The Americans could afford to treat enemy wounded because they could afford everything else. Their mercy was expensive, requiring surplus resources and systematic organization that extended from the factory floor in Detroit to the crater on Iwo Jima. But this does not diminish the significance of the principle itself. Systems reveal their true nature under pressure, when maintaining values becomes costly and difficult. The American military medical system, for all its imperfections, maintained its commitment to treating wounded, regardless of nationality, even when doing so was inconvenient, dangerous, or seemingly counterproductive. That commitment reflected something fundamental about the society that had created the military, a belief in individual human worth that could be extended, however imperfectly, even to those who had been trying to kill you moments before. Lieutenant Watanabe died in 1987. At the age of 68, having lived through Japan's post-war transformation from defeated empire to economic superpower to mature democracy. In his later years, he occasionally spoke to students about his wartime experiences, and he always included the story of the American medic in the volcanic crater. He would describe the morphine syringe, the pressure bandage, the chocolate bar given by an enemy who had every reason to hate him but chose instead to help him. And he would tell his audiences that this moment, more than any battle or defeat, had taught him the most important lesson of the war. I learned, he would say, that the Americans were strong not despite their kindness, but because of it. They could maintain their principles even in war, because their system was fundamentally sound. We Japanese had been told that democracy made them weak, that individual rights made them unable to sacrifice. But I saw that their system produced soldiers who could make their own decisions, who could be trusted to do the right thing without constant supervision, who believed in something beyond mere obedience. That is why they won. And that is why, in losing to them, Japan gained the opportunity to become something better than we had been. This is the truth that emerges from the historical record, from the diaries and memoirs and official reports that document the Pacific War. American medics treating Japanese wounded first was not an aberration or a propaganda invention. It was standard operating procedure, the logical outcome of a military medical system that prioritized need over nationality. And in that procedure, carried out thousands of times across the Pacific theater, lay a demonstration of power far more subtle and lasting than any battleship or bomber. The power to destroy is impressive. The power to destroy, while maintaining your principles, is transformative. Japan learned this lesson at terrible cost, through defeat and occupation and the long process of rebuilding. But the lesson was real and it persisted. The post-war alliance between Japan and the United States, the transformation of a militarist empire into a democratic nation, the reconciliation between former enemies, all of this was built on a foundation that included, among many other factors, the memory of American medics treating Japanese wounded in volcanic craters and jungle clearings across the Pacific. History is made of grand strategies and decisive battles, of political decisions and economic forces. But it is also made of small moments. A morphine syringe administered in combat, a chocolate bar given to an enemy, a surgeon working through the night to save a life regardless of the uniform the patient wore. These moments accumulate and compound, creating ripples that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. They become stories, then symbols, then foundations for the possibility of something better than endless hatred and revenge. Lieutenant Watanabe's moment in the crater was one such moment. It was not unique. Thousands of Japanese soldiers experienced similar encounters. But it was real and it mattered. It changed one man's understanding of the enemy he had been taught to hate and the system he had been taught to defend. And through that change, it became part of the larger transformation that ended the war and built the peace that followed. The volcanic sand of Iwo Jima is still black, still hot under the Pacific sun. The island is quiet now, home to a small Japanese garrison and the ghosts of a battle that killed nearly 7,000 Americans and more than 20,000 Japanese. Monuments mark where the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi. But there are no monuments to the medics who moved through the battle treating wounded without regard to nationality, or to the hospital ships that received Japanese and American casualties side by side, or to the 1,000 small acts of mercy that punctuated the violence. Perhaps there should be, because those acts, as much as any battle, determined the shape of the post-war world. They demonstrated that it was possible to fight with ferocity while maintaining humanity, to defeat an enemy without destroying the possibility of eventual reconciliation. They showed that principles could survive contact with reality, that systems mattered as much as individual courage, that the way a nation treated its enemies in war revealed something fundamental about its capacity for leadership in peace. The American medic who treated Lieutenant Watanabe in February 1945 probably never knew what became of the Japanese officer, whose leg he splintered and whose pain he eased with morphine. He moved on to the next casualty, and the next, and the next, following a routine that had been drilled into him through training, and that he maintained because it was his duty and his profession. He was not trying to win hearts and minds or demonstrate the superiority of democratic values. He was simply doing his job, following the protocols of military medicine as the U.S. Army had taught them to him. But in doing that job, he became part of something larger than himself, a system that, for all its flaws and compromises, maintained a commitment to certain principles even in the midst of total war. He became part of the American demonstration of power that was not merely destructive, but also constructive, not merely defeating, but also transforming. And that demonstration, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific theater, helped create the conditions for the post-war reconciliation that turned Japan from enemy to ally, from militarist empire to democratic partner. This is what happened when Japanese officers saw American medics treating enemy wounded first. Ideology confronted reality, propaganda encountered truth, and the certainties that had sustained a military culture collapsed in the face of evidence that could not be denied or explained away. The war was won by aircraft carriers and submarines, by bombers and marines, by industrial capacity and strategic superiority. But the peace was won in part by medics with morphine syringes and chocolate bars, who treated wounded Japanese soldiers as humans rather than as enemies, who maintained their principles when it would have been easier to abandon them, who demonstrated that American strength included not just the power to destroy, but also the power to heal. That was the lesson of the volcanic crater, the hospital ship, the prisoner of war camp. That was the truth that Lieutenant Watanabe carried with him from Iwo Jima to Tokyo to the post-war world. And that truth, multiplied across thousands of individual encounters, helped build the foundation for the reconciliation and alliance that transformed the Pacific from a battlefield into a region of peace and prosperity. The medics who treated enemy wounded first were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were professionals doing their jobs. But in doing those jobs with skill and humanity, they accomplished something more lasting than any battlefield victory. They proved that it was possible to wage war without losing sight of peace, to defeat enemies without destroying the possibility of eventual friendship, to exercise power without abandoning principle. That accomplishment stands as one of the genuine achievements of American arms in the Second World War, less celebrated than the battles, but no less significant for the world that emerged from the conflict.